Well, today is a special day in history. It is Article 50 Day, if you want to look at it that way, or you can say Britain's Declaration of Independence from the EU. That's the article that they are using to move out of the EU. They served their official notification today in a letter, and as you can see that picture of Nigel Farage, he is a very happy man. He labored for many years in the wilderness to make this happen. And as he said, you lot were laughing at me before, you're not laughing now. No, they're very angry about that. We're going to talk about that. But first, let's talk about what he said. He put out, you've been triggered. And that's true in a lot of ways. Not only have they triggered BREXIT, and they'll have 2 years to do this, to complete this transaction. And of course, it's also going to be something else. The next step is going to be the Great Repeal Bill. Have you heard of that? Well, that's something we'll talk about in just a moment. That's coming up in a little while in terms of Theresa May, their prime minister, putting out the terms of what they're going to try to do to reconcile the relationship between Britain and the European Union. But as he was putting this out, he had a journalist stop by, as I point out on Infowars.com from the Breitbart article. As a journalist tried to rain on his parade, said, well, what do you say to the 48% who wanted to stay in and who today find that it's a disappointing day? And Farage says, well, it may have been 48% on June 23rd last year, but things have changed hugely. Consistent opinion polls show nearly 70% of the population want the government to get on with Brexit. I want us to leave with a sensible free trade deal in place, fully understanding we are their most important export market in the world. They call us Treasure Island, and for a good reason. Okay, now one of the people who came out and spoke about this was, of course, Roger Daltrey of The Who. I guess what he's saying now is let's get out of this web that the globalists have created. Let's not get fooled again. And he said he wasn't really necessarily happy about it at the time. He might be some of those people who are in that change from 48% to 70% that Nigel Farage was talking about. He said, I'm not anti-European, but I am anti-present the way we are being governed in Europe. It's nothing to do with any of the immigrants or anything like that for me. It was to do with much more. The majority of this country felt that their voices were not being heard. It's kind of like, taxation without representation, regulation without representation, somebody else controlling your economy, telling you where you can fish, saying these areas that you have fished in for generations, for centuries, those are off limits to you, but we're going to let somebody else fish there instead. That's the type of thing that they were concerned about. He said it would have been nice to do a deal in Europe, but they didn't want to do a deal. They sent Cameron back with a bag. He said, I'm sad about how we voted, but I think we have to go on with it now. So there you go. That's exactly what Nigel Farage was talking about. So what is this deal? Well, the deal that they've got 2 years to work out is basically everything in the relationship between the UK and the EU. It's going to include things like law enforcement agreements. How are they going to shake hands in terms of exchanging information about international criminals, that type of thing. Also, the status of citizens who are in the EU and the UK and vice versa. So EU citizens in the UK and the citizens who are in the other direction. And also who they're going to give citizenship to. Are they going to recognize the citizenship if it's given to refugees who come into their country? That's going to be a sticky issue. But the central issue that dwarfs all the rest of these are trade. Now, when it comes to the final deal with all these other issues, the individual European Union states will have a vote, and the EU Parliament, however, will have a veto. There's not going to be any amendments. It's going to be on a take-it-or-leave-it basis. Now, as RT is pointing out, the Europhiles in the European Union Parliament may try to punish Britain over Brexit as a warning to other states who might want to get out of the EU. But then they talk about this. This is the man that they talked to is research director of the Institute of Economic Affairs, Richard Wellings, and he makes a good case as to why they may not want to try to punish Britain. He says the EU can't really afford some kind of a trade war over Brexit that could knock a few percentage points off the medium-term growth rate in the European Union. He said there's a danger some of the diehard Europhiles and the European Commission and the European Parliament will try to play hardball to punish Britain, to try to deter other nations that might be thinking about leaving. But I think common sense will prevail, particularly because a lot of powerful special interests, in other words, people with jobs or big businesses or whatever, they don't want to have a trade war. They want to still be able to trade with Britain. There's a lot of trade that goes on between both countries that's mutually beneficial. And they're going to want, like the German car industry, is going to pressure the German politicians who would like to punish the Brits. They are going to pressure their politicians not to do that. He said, they say we need to get a pretty good deal because we rely on the UK for a huge proportion of our exports. I do think that we will avoid a trade war. And then they go on and ask him another interesting question. I say, Prime Minister May says the UK will have to trade on World Trade Organization terms when it leaves the bloc. Do you think that'll work? He says, well, it might work, but I think better still, the UK could, if they wanted to, adopt a policy of unilateral free trade, which is what they do in Hong Kong and Singapore. The UK would have no tariffs on imports. People would be able to import stuff without any high tariffs. They could buy expensive products from the EU. The UK consumers could buy cheap goods from across the world. Says it'll be hugely beneficial for the UK economy and particularly for low-income households that have to pay a fortune for overpriced EU goods, particularly food. Well, see, they could do a unilateral free trade, or they could negotiate with other countries outside the European Union in bilateral agreements. That's what Donald Trump wants to do. See, it is possible because we have done this in the past. When we didn't have multinational globalist organizations that were going to dictate terms to a group of nations in order to empower themselves, put themselves in a position of sovereignty over those nations, because if you control the purse strings, you control those nations. So that's what Donald Trump is rejecting. That's what Nigel Farage and all of us who are against globalism are rejecting, are the multilateral trade agreements that only serve to empower the interests of these large multinational organizations and take away the sovereignty from the individual states. Bilateral trade agreements that are negotiated between two countries are a great thing, and they're actually much easier to achieve. Now, the next step is going to be the Great Repeal Bill. They say on Thursday, Prime Minister Theresa May will publish details of the next step, which is the Great Repeal Bill. What is that? Well, they say it's going to ultimately involve fundamental decisions on who holds powers of regulation in Britain, what kind of rules the country will have in the future. So the interesting thing about this is that they're not really repealing the sovereignty of European law. Right now, European law is the primacy, okay? It is the ultimate, the highest law. That's one of the reasons why they wanted to get out, is because the Europeans, the European Parliament, are making their laws, and their laws supersede British laws. Now, the first step to do this is they're actually, interestingly enough, they're going to put all of the EU laws into British law. Now, that sounds like they haven't really accomplished anything, does it? But wait, there's a good reason for that, and they can still fix things with this. There's so many different rules and regulations that have been created by the EU, because remember, we have in the United States, our massive bureaucracy creates about 80,000 pages of regulations a year. So they have so many regulations that if they tried to analyze these on a one-by-one basis, they would never get finished in time to do this within the 2-year period. And the entire country would be in a state of chaos as they're trying to figure out what the real rules are going to be. So they're going to bring in that body of law, which will maintain the status quo. But what they're doing is asserting the fact that now Britain can alter or abolish any of these laws that are currently in place, that were put there by the European Union. They can change those laws because now Britons will be sovereign about what's going on. So that's an interesting way that this is going to happen. And I think there's an interesting parallel too here in the United States, because Steve Bannon has said that he envisions, his vision certainly for the Trump administration, is a dismantling of the administrative state. Well, see, that's what they're trying to do now in Britain with Brexit, is dismantle the European administrative state. But we have something that is far worse than Brussels. We have Washington, D.C. A lot more rules, a lot more regulations, has been there a lot longer. How do we get rid of that? How do we do it? Because we can't do it overnight, just like they can't get rid of the EU overnight. It's a gradual process. We do have already the legal structure to do that. We didn't need an Article 50. We had Amendments 9 and 10 in the Constitution that were put there a long time ago. So the people who created the Constitution realized that there were some clauses in there that could be twisted and could be stretched to make the central government more powerful and to elevate it in all areas above the states. And so they wanted to make sure that was not going to happen. And so they put in the 9th and 10th Amendment to clarify that. But of course, we don't pay any attention to that anymore. And I think one of the examples of this is, how do we do an exit from the EPA? You could call it EP exit, whatever. How do we get away from just that one bureaucracy? And we talked about that yesterday. We have Donald Trump is going to put in a couple of executive orders, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment as to what effect that's really going to have, how they're going to fight against that. We have to understand that we don't have anything that remotely resembles the constitutional power structures anymore. We don't have 3 branches of government. We don't have the SCOTUS, POTUS, and Congress, right? We don't have the Supreme Court, the President of the United States, and Congress. We don't have that anymore. We don't have three equal branches out here. Now what we have is a hierarchy where they've been put one above the other, stacked up like that. And we have to understand that who do you think is on top? Well, I would argue that it is the Supreme Court that is on top because they have the final say over everything. They're going to have the final say over Trump's executive order for the EPA, just as they did over Trump's executive order for immigration. Understand that they were able to shut that down, even though it was against nations that Barack Obama had gone to war with. The Supreme Court and the judicial system, which is highly politicized, understand, and not accountable to U.S. citizens, they were able to shut that down. So whenever Obama does an executive order, we have the Supreme Court, because they are politicized and left-leaning and statists, they typically give him a rubber stamp. So that's okay. But if Trump were to do something that is going to divest power out of the state, you can bet that they're going to try to fight him on that. And so what we have in reality is not these three branches of government in Washington, but we have the Supreme Court, and underneath that, a fourth branch of government, the permanent bureaucracy. Think of the bureaucracy in Washington as the bureaucracy in Brussels, the EU bureaucracy that they were trying to get rid of. And you understand that they're the ones who write the laws and write the rules because Congress has abdicated that power to them. As I said before, it's not any coincidence that both Nancy Pelosi and Paul Ryan are saying we got to pass it to see what's in it. Okay? They don't know what's in it. They don't want to know what's in it. They either hand off the power to do this to an existing bureaucracy, or they create an entirely new bureaucracy to handle this. That's the way that they operate. And once they create this power, put this power in the regulatory agencies, you have none of the protections in the Bill of Rights against presumption of innocence, to say that you're going to have a trial by your peers, that you're going to have not going to have excessive fines levied against you if you're found guilty. You don't have any of that. You are accused of civil law. You have to sue them. There's no presumption of innocence. You don't usually get a jury of your peers. Usually it is a tribunal of bureaucrats that look at you, and they will decide what the fines are. And they can be very excessive, and they say it doesn't matter because this is not criminal, it is civil. So that's the way they do this, and it is not at all like the Schoolhouse Rock version of history that you've seen. So let's take a look at this, another look at the climate change, the rolling back Obama's Clean Power Plan. As The New American points out, Obama bragged on television about how he was going to necessarily cause electricity prices to skyrocket. Skyrocketing was his term. He also said he was going to bankrupt the coal industry. While not explicitly mentioned in the executive order, Trump's latest actions, points out The New American, will effectively also nullify U.S. compliance with the UN Paris Agreement that Obama signed without the constitutionally mandated advice and consent of the U.S. Senate. So you would think it would be easy to get rid of this, right? Because it's not a real treaty. He didn't get the Senate to sign off on it. He signed off on it. John Kerry signed off on it. So we're not really in that treaty. The UN scheme, they say, negotiated in Paris by the UN, call for, among other policies, dramatic controls placed on the economy and energy in particular under the guise of controlling global warming. This pseudo-treaty also called for trillions of dollars in wealth redistribution from Western taxpayers to third world governments and dictators. They were saying, you are going to have to pay to build infrastructure in the third world to meet our climate goals. Now, Donald Trump campaigned on this. He called this global warming theory a hoax. He said he was going to cancel this UN scheme, and it is a UN scheme. But the language to get rid of the Paris Climate Treaty was not in this executive order. Why? As I pointed out briefly yesterday, it appears, based on a report from Wall Street Journal, and Daily Caller analyzes this, Ivanka and Jared, his daughter and son-in-law, intervened to strip language critical of the Paris Climate Accords out of an executive order. They say that Kushner and Ivanka intervened to strike language about the climate deal from an earlier draft of the executive order. That's what sources close to the matter told the Wall Street Journal. They say that his daughter, Trump's daughter, and her husband have been considered a moderating influence on the White House's position on climate change and environmental issues. Now the executive order will have no mention of the so-called Paris Agreement. Now these two executive orders that Trump is expected to sign, he's going to focus on the Clean Power Plan, this moratorium on the new coal mining leases, which he did yesterday in the ceremony with coal miners, and the Waters of the U.S. rule. That is a very extensive and aggressive usurpation of power. They point out that Trump promised to withdraw us from this Paris agreement to stop global warming payments to the UN while on the campaign trail, but his opposition to Obama's climate agenda seems to be running up against his daughter's plan. See, this is the thing that concerns me, should concern you as well. We had promises that were made to voters. Trump made those promises to voters. Hopefully, he is going to stick to that rather than go with what his daughter said. His daughter was not part of the discussion about climate change. She was not on the ballot. We did not vote for her views on climate change. We voted to get rid of this treaty as well as to change the rules of the EPA, that they have overstepped their bounds. However, another analysis of the New American, they say that they believe that this is going to effectively be nullified. They say that, and here's an example of how dangerous this is to our country. Global warming is already exceeding $1.5 trillion a year. That's about $4 billion a day. You want to make the economy great again? We've got to get out of this treaty. In the UK, they're trying to drain the European Union swamp. And how do we do that in the United States? How do we get rid of and dismantle this administrative state that is unaccountable, unelected in Washington? And of course, a very hopeful sign are the moves that have been made against the EPA, the executive orders. But as I pointed out, those orders are going to be challenged in court. The final say will be made by the politicized court system. So it's going to be quite a struggle that we have coming up. We have to understand that in order to dismantle the state, we have to dismantle the foundation. That's why I said it's so important when we look at Obamacare that we not use the powers that were given to one of these bureaucracies, Health and Human Services, that we not use those powers given to a health czar to say, well, we're going to fix the details of it. That's kind of like if you remember Lord of the Rings, Boromir say, if you could give me that ring, I could use that power for good. No, what it does is it takes over, it delegitimizes you, and it destroys the rule of law, which is the corrupting influence of that power. So we have to destroy the foundation. That means we have to destroy the justification for it as well as the mechanisms of that. And we're going to take a look at the Department of Justice, what people are calling out for there, as well as the head fake that was put out by the mainstream media and the left today saying that Congress is trying to kill your privacy. Well, yes, they are, but not in the way that they're saying today. They're trying to cover that up. Before I do that, I just want to go back to where we are with this. Remember, we had forces within an internal debate within the Trump administration, as the Hill points out, fighting against calling out the climate treaty out of Paris, and it's not really an official treaty, trying to keep that from being in these executive orders. And it's not just Ivanka and Jared, but it is also Rex Tillerson. And a lot of people would say, well, that doesn't make any sense because he was an oil company executive. If you're an oil company, you want people to think of your product as being very scarce. You want to be the people who have the monopoly on diamonds like De Beers. And that's why the oil companies are pushing this hoax of global warming. So there are people within the Trump administration that are pushing back on it. But they still believe, and the Hill and the people who are concerned about this, who oppose us on this issue, still believe that the Paris Climate Treaty is going to be killed because of the executive orders that Donald Trump has put in. It's not going to be implemented. It would have been difficult, they said, even with the Clean Power Plan in place, but it is going to be impossible to achieve what we've committed to under the Paris Agreement. And remember, that is not our commitment. That was Barack Obama's commitment. He didn't have the Senate sign on to that, and he's gone, thankfully. Now, we also see from WorldNet Daily that now Attorney General Sessions is urged to clean up the ideological rot at the Department of Justice. Again, we have to say that you have to move against this justification as well as move against the mechanism. And they're saying that there are a lot of people who are ideologically entrenched federal bureaucrats who've jettisoned precepts like equal enforcement in favor of political and radicalized dogma. They say for years, a radicalized civil rights division heavy-handedly advanced leftist causes with respect to voting law, law enforcement, immigration, and others, while constitutional rule of law was considered to be a nuisance. So that's one of the things that has to be taken away. Now, today we had a couple of headlines I thought were very interesting. CNN, good example. Why is the government searching your cell phones? They talk about how they gave themselves a power several years ago to confiscate your cell phone and get all the information there. And they're doing this in spite of a landmark 2014 Supreme Court decision. Remember, the Supreme Court says, oh, can't do that? Well, they don't care. They're going to do it anyway if they want to. Meanwhile, they have another one says Congress just killed your internet privacy protections. Well, you mean if they ignore the Constitution, even ignore their beloved Supreme Court rulings that we still have privacy, and somehow the Republicans, the House, the Senate, and President Trump have now killed your privacy on the internet? That is not what's going on. We all know that they've been after all of our documents on the internet for quite some time. What is really happening is that there's a competition between the FCC and the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the Federal Communications Commission. Remember, the Federal Communications Commission tried to usurp power over the internet last year, and the Obama administration tried to help them with that. What they have said with this new legislation that has passed the Senate, passed the House, and is now going to go to President Trump to sign, and is being supported by Republicans, what they are saying with that is they want to get the FCC out of this business. As a matter of fact, Trump's FCC chairman that he appointed says, we don't want the FCC running the internet. These issues can be decided at the FTC. And so that's truly what is behind this. Certainly, your privacy hasn't been protected because these were 11th hour rules that were put in by Obama. So you didn't have these kind of privacy protections anyway. What they don't want you to see is CISPA. Actually, it became CISA when they finally got it through. The fact that the government can go in and get all that information. Now, they're right to say that the information that is collected by your internet service providers is far more detailed than the kind of information that's being collected by Facebook and others, but this is a head fake.
Alex Jones here with a very important news update to anybody out there that wants to be prepared. But it goes beyond being prepared. Our bodies absolutely must have the good halogen iodine or we will die. And you look at all of the thyroid problems and all the people that don't have energy and that have all sorts of hormone problems. And from my research, and a lot of just mainline research, it leads back to iodine over and over and over again. It's as important as vitamin C. If you don't get iodine, you die. But most people are just deficient, so they're low energy, they're sick. You got to have iodine in your body so that your body can produce the hormones you need. It is the base to so many things. And since I got into iodine 4 years ago, we've helped change the entire paradigm by developing and bringing to the public deep earth crystals from 7,000 to 12,000 feet of the purest iodine available. Other iodine comes from the ocean or from other byproducts of chemical facilities and is tainted. It's bound. It's not absorbable. I tried it. And I had incredible effects even with dirty iodine because the body needs it. When you don't have iodine, it absorbs the chlorine, the fluoride, and all these other bad halogens. Do yourself and your family a favor and check out the importance of iodine for yourself. I think you're going to be blown away. And whatever you do, support the broadcast and get a bottle of Survival Shield Nascent Iodine X2. Also consult your physician because if you've been deficient in it or have other issues, it can have some dramatic effects. As for me and most folks I talk to, it's been a game changer in the positive column, but still consult your physician because iodine is no joke. It's a key building block of the body. And if you haven't had it for a long time and suddenly have it, some folks say they've experienced things like a detoxing effect and things like that. You've got to have vitamin C. You've got to have iodine to live. You've got to have water to live. Iodine is key. You must have it, but consult your physician first before you get powerful Survival Shield Nascent Iodine X2 at InfoWarsLife.com or call toll free. We can answer your questions, 888-253-3139.